With the Synod on Synodality set to begin in just a few months, moral theology and traditional Catholic teaching on sexuality seem to be under daily assault, even from within the Church. Where is the voice of reason upon which the faithful have been able to depend throughout Church history? My next guest has been asking just that question. He's the professor of theology at Franciscan University of Steubenville and author of a recent column in Crisis magazine entitled "Put an End to the Madness." Would you welcome Dr. Regis Martin to the program? Professor Martin, thank you for being here. I want to begin with your recent op-ed in Crisis, where you write jokingly about placing a call to Pope Francis during his Wednesday audience, and you ask him to stop all the madness. In your telling, Francis does take the call. What point were you making by beginning your op-ed that way? What were you attempting to do there?
Well, somebody said that if you don't try to slay your audience, your reader with your first sentence, you might lose them. So I thought maybe I would begin with a spoof, a send-up, and it was really a caper. But a lot of people misunderstood and thought that I had, in fact, contacted the Holy Father. And if they knew anything about my computer skills, I don't even own a smartphone. I can barely dial my own number. But I thought that would be a good point of entry to sort of electrify the attention of my reader.
Yeah, and you write about several problems you see under this pontificate, beginning with the deposit of faith, the depletion of which you say appears to have been programmatic and a programmatic theme of this pontificate from the start. Where do you most see a depletion of the deposit of faith? And why are more of the faithful, and even bishops, not pushing back against it?
Well, I think there is a twofold crisis that we face. On the one hand, a straight-out crisis of faith. People don't know what to believe. There's really no sense of the faith. But then there's a crisis of courage. And I think this afflicts a great many of the bishops and cardinals. They certainly know what the deposit of faith is, but they don't seem able to summon the courage to defend it. And that I find pretty shocking and really rather unprecedented. I mean, we have to go back maybe to the 4th century, the crisis of Arianism, to find the same sort of systemic silence in the face of a full-throated assault upon the basic teachings of the Church.
Yeah. What were the two, if I could get you to focus on the two most egregious departures from traditional teaching and that deposit of faith that really alerted you or alarmed you early on? Were there one or two that you just said, wait a minute, we shouldn't go down this path?
No, a couple of flashpoints. I think initially back in 2016 when he struck the deal with Islam and he conceded that there's a lot of pluralism in the world and that as regards religion, this was somehow God's will. This was his creative intention, part of divine providence, to permit a diversity of religious opinion, which strikes me as a direct frontal assault upon the centrality of Christ. This downsizes the presence of Christ. He's been relativized. He doesn't seem to be as indispensable as he once was. If we have other equally legitimate voices. And the other flashpoint, of course, was in the moral order. That interview that the Pope submitted to, that Disney later picked up and turned into a documentary. A bunch of kids are firing questions at the Vicar of Christ, and of course, they're all about sex. And the Pope pretty much gives the game away by saying that the Church's catechesis on sex is still in diapers, which seemed to me really insulting. I mean, the shade of Aquinas must be shaking to think that his moral theology was so infantile that we had to wait another 1,000 years for the kids in California to improve upon it. I found that very offensive.
Yeah, no, I think, Dr. Martin, you and I may be the only two people who actually sat through that spectacle. I mean, I forced myself to watch it one night, but I did so alone, so I didn't afflict the rest of the family. But it's kind of shocking. I mean, you got a woman who does porn, on the side. You got a transgender kid who's kind of hassling the Pope about, why don't you affirm me? It was a very strange and rather bizarre outing, and I don't know why anyone near the Pope would have allowed such a thing, But anyway, the German Synodal Way has been slow rolling for years, offering things like bishops approving the blessings of same-sex couples, lay preaching during Mass, the possibility of women being ordained, and a request that priestly celibacy be re-examined by the Vatican. Now, you point out that this Pope has done virtually nothing to stop it. Why do you think not? I mean, he did issue, or offices in the Vatican, rather, did issue rather targeted corrections along the way.
Well, I mean, there are one of two possible explanations. Either there's a want of courage, so we need to put some moral starch into his papal shirt, or he simply doesn't believe anymore, and that I think is really frightening. Look, a basic right, which I think every Catholic has, and the violation of that right has been fairly routine in recent years, is the right to remain secure in the possession of one's faith. You ought to know, on the strength of what I believe, that I can summon the courage to confront my persecutors. And they come in all sizes and shapes. I mean, there was a time when the Roman Empire sought to exterminate Christianity. And then in the last century, the Third Reich was bent upon the liquidation of faith. Or maybe it's the local CCD coordinator who flatters herself with the latest fashion in liberal theology. But whatever the source, Catholics, I think, are entitled, as a matter of simple justice, to remain secure, to have a serene sense of what it is I believe, what is permissible Roman Catholic doctrine, and what is beyond the pale. And when hotshot theologians, swashbuckling moralists, decide to blow up the faith and the church's moral tradition, I would hope that the Pope would step into the breach and say, no, you can't do that. That's wrong. Let me unplug that machinery because it's running amok. And this Pope hasn't done that. And that to me is just inexplicable.
Yeah, well, why do you think he hasn't? Why do you think he's so tolerant of not only diverse viewpoints, to put it kindly, within the church, but even outside of the church, attacks on the faith and questions of long-settled antiquity are now suddenly up for grabs again?
I don't know. I can't really look into the soul of the Vicar of Christ, but I can tell you this, that early on he wanted to make a mess, and right now he's got a bloody mess, and somebody has to clean it up. And it doesn't look as if he's disposed to do so. One thing I do know is that you can have bad popes, and we can survive that because the devil and hell will not prevail against God's church. But what we mustn't do is sort of deify the papacy, divinize it as if everything he says is de fide. Sometimes what he says is it's off the wall, and cardinals and bishops should call him up on that. And their failure to do so, I think, invites a deep cynicism on the part of ordinary church-going Catholics.
In an interview last week, Bishop Georg Batzing, who is the president of the German Bishops' Conference, said he believes, quote, the vast majority of Catholics in Germany support the decisions of the Synodal Way, and he sees no danger of a schism as a result of the direction being taken by the Church in Germany. He did acknowledge that concerns about the Synodal Way have grown, but said, quote, that is precisely why we need more synodality, in the sense of a common search for what the Spirit of God is telling us today and where it is leading. Polarizations are a great danger, not only in society, but also within the church, he said, especially when the relevant protagonists and groups no longer talk to each other. Dr. Martin, you've been a theologian for decades. What is synodality, and how did this become a destination unto itself, spiritually speaking?
I think it's been a dead letter. I would never have endorsed it or encouraged the spread of it. I think it's an invitation to catastrophe, to a kind of collapse of the church's sense of herself, stripping of everything distinctively Catholic. And we have to put a stop to it. It doesn't go anywhere except straight to hell. And I think no one wants to go there.
In an interview last month with German media, Bishop Johann Boni, the Bishop of Antwerp, Belgium, said that the Flemish bishop's decision to bless same-sex unions was, quote, not going against the Pope. Bishop Boni said that he inferred this from two conversations he had with Pope Francis himself. When asked if blessing same-sex unions gave him a conflict of conscience, as he was going against a 2021 Vatican ruling by the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, which states that the church may not bless same-sex unions, he said, quote, no, because it is about the Pope. Not every man in Rome is Pope. From my conversations, I know what my relationship with Pope Francis looks like. We speak cum Petro et sub Petro, with and under Peter, but not the whole Vatican is cum Petro et sub Petro. The Vatican has different positions and developments, and there are theological faculties in Rome that also belong to the Vatican and the Catholic Church. Rome is not just a document or a cardinal. No, Rome is also unity in diversity. Now, Dr. Martin, the Register's Ed Penton asked the Vatican spokesman, Matteo Bruni, if the Vatican would be responding to Bishop Boni's claims. So far, we've heard nothing. Now, your thoughts on this, and do you see this kind of blatant disregard for church teaching and Vatican authority continuing as this synod process progresses?
It does seem to me that if something is regarded as sacred, inviolable, then you would expect people to rally round and defend it, to shore up the best possible arguments in defense of what is, after all, an abiding, fundamental, indispensable deposit of belief. And the silence on that invites, I think, a kind of cynical regard for these people who have been charged with the maintenance of the faith. If they won't come forward and defend the faith, then maybe they don't think it's defensible. And they should be honest and acknowledge it publicly and then become Protestants. Look, we could lose all of Germany and much of Northern Europe. The popes before have taken that risk when they told Henry, you can't divorce your wife and remarry. That's adultery. And we're prepared to allow the whole of Europe to be fractured because the defense of marriage is worth it. I think we may have to summon that kind of courage in the 21st century and tell the Germans, look, you've gone too far. We're pulling the plug on this. You're welcome to become Protestants, but you can't maintain a Catholic identity anymore. It's dishonest.
Oh. During his Wednesday audience on May 24th, Pope Francis marked the World Day of Prayer for the Church in China. This was a day instituted by Pope Benedict in 2007 to be held annually on the Feast of Mary, Help of Christians. Pope Francis had this to say to the people of China and the world. And he's saying here, I wish to assure my thoughts and closeness to our brothers and sisters in China and share in their joys and hopes. I offer a special thought to all those who suffer, pastors and the faithful, so that in the communion and solidarity of the universal church, they may experience consolation and encouragement. Dr. Martin, your thoughts? I mean, the suffering of Catholics in China has been, that they've seen, really is at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. This pontificate has entered into that China-Vatican deal with this regime and renewed it twice. They've been loath to criticize the Chinese government. And while it's wonderful to hear the Holy Father invoke the Chinese church, which he's done for the last 3 weeks, is this enough?
No, it's obviously not enough. I mean, no, it isn't. It's kind of sick-making, really. On the one hand, you extend consolation to these people who are suffering, but in large part because of your policies and your failure to rebuke those who are subjugating them. This, to me, is a double standard. It's sheer humbuggery. If you really cared about the Chinese people who are, languishing beneath the boot of a communist regime, then at least have the kidney to say to the leadership in Beijing, look, this is wrong. You've got to stop doing it. You need to treat people humanely and allow them to practice their faith in a completely unfettered way. You can't manage the interior life, and that's what they're doing, and the Pope ought to be able to say that. It's not a matter of diplomacy, it's a matter of speaking the truth to power.
This week on Pentecost Monday, over 20,000 Catholic pilgrims filled the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Chartres in France after walking 3 days from Paris to pray that full freedom to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass could be possible. More than half of the people making the pilgrimage are young Catholics, under 20 years old. Pope Francis began the restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass with that motu proprio, Guardians of Tradition, back in 2021. And they've seen restrictions on the TLM since then. What do you see as the message here? And how do you think Rome is accepting this? I mean, this is a youthful, organic demonstration of love for the liturgy, which one rarely sees ever.
You know, there's a great line from the poet W.H. Auden, who says, legislation is helpless against the wild prayer of longing. And you can see in these young French Catholics a longing for God, a desire for God, a hunger for transcendence, which is given a particular liturgical expression. And the Pope wants to stamp that out. That strikes me as really hideous. And why he would want to do that when here is a fresh, vibrant outpouring of faith on the part of young people who witness to that faith at huge cost to themselves. It would seem to me that you would want to affirm and promote that, encourage it. This is a genuine sign. These are signs of the times, which I think the Pope ought to seize upon and promote. The fact that he doesn't, that he's determined to somehow suppress it, seems to me completely bizarre.
Yeah, well, I'm always stunned that, for people who are listening and seeking the movement of the Holy Spirit, when it comes to you in Technicolor with thousands of young people waving banners and in silent prayer and chanting the tradition of the eternal, language of the church, everybody covers their ears and closes their eyes. So no accompaniment for them. It does strike me as bizarre, too, and inexplicable. I mean, it's like cutting the youthful limbs off of a tree. It makes no sense to me, and a dying tree at that. What needs to be done, in your estimation, Dr. Martin, to restore the deposit of faith and mend the fractures that you see in the church today?
Well, I think it's at bottom a Christological crisis. I mean, who is Christ for me? Is he the centerpiece of my faith? Is he the heart of the world? Is he Alpha and Omega? And if he is, then he ought to be everywhere, and he ought to be enshrined in every place. You can't relativize him. You can't marginalize him. You can't negotiate with the enemies of Christ and say, well, look, we'll compromise here and maybe there and not mention him quite so often. If you remove Christ, then you don't have a church. You eviscerate it. Right at the heart of the church is Christ. And I would say, return to Christ, restore the primacy of Christ, and let his vicar sing out his praises in season and out.
We will leave it there. Thank you so much for the time. And you can read Put an End to the Madness by Dr. Regis Martin on Crisis Magazine's website. That's crisismagazine.com. Thanks again.
Well, thank you.